Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where night was not simply the time after sunset. In the Middle Ages, darkness changed the shape of a village, the meaning of a sound, the safety of a road, and even the way people imagined the unseen. What feels peaceful to us now could feel watchful, crowded, and strangely alive to them. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what quiet corner of history you'd like us to explore next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, leaving a like is a simple way to support it. And if you'd like more calm, intelligent history for late evenings, you're warmly invited to subscribe. So let's begin where every medieval night began. Not with silence, but with the slow disappearance of control. For most people living in medieval Europe, the setting of the sun was not a gentle decorative moment. It was a practical turning point. Daylight was labor, movement, trade, visibility, gossip, market calls, church bells, animals, tools, carts, and human judgment. Night removed many of those things at once. It did not make the world empty. It made the world harder to read. Modern people often imagine medieval night as naturally quiet, almost romantic. A dark sky without city lights, stars spread cleanly overhead, a candle glowing in a timber house, perhaps the distant sound of an owl. Some of that could be true. The medieval night sky, especially away from towns, could be astonishingly bright with stars. The Milky Way was not a poetic abstraction. It was a visible presence. Moonlight could silver rooftops, tracks, fields, and hedges. But that beauty came with a sharper awareness. When there was no switch on the wall, no streetlight at the corner, no police patrol reachable by telephone, darkness was not background. Darkness was a condition. And the first thing to understand is that medieval people were not irrational simply because they feared the night. Their fears grew out of real limits. A road at night was genuinely more dangerous than a road by day. A ditch, a broken-wheel rut, an exposed route, a sudden animal, a stranger at the edge of the lane. These were not dramatic inventions. They were ordinary risks made worse by poor visibility. A familiar path could become uncertain. A neighbor's field could become a black mass. A churchyard could seem larger than it had seemed at noon. The same landscape did not disappear. It became ambiguous. This is one of the quiet misunderstandings modern viewers often bring to medieval history. We tend to separate practical fear from supernatural fear, as though one was sensible and the other was foolish. But in a medieval night, those categories were not always separate. If you heard something moving beyond the house wall, it might be a thief. It might be a loose pig. It might be a fox near the hens. It might be the wind pressing through a gap in the roof. Or, in the imagination of the time, it might be something less visible, less human, less easily named. The uncertainty itself was the problem. Night made interpretation difficult. Inside the home, the darkness did not always bring privacy. That may be the strangest part for a modern listener. We often associate night with personal space. A bedroom, a closed door, a bed to oneself, darkness as retreat. But for many medieval households, especially poorer ones, night meant compression. People gathered into the same small interior space with animals nearby or sometimes under the same roof. Smoke from the hearth lingered. Bedding was shared. Children slept close to parents, servants, apprentices, grandparents, or unrelated workers. The medieval house was not arranged around the modern idea of private bedrooms. It was arranged around heat, storage, labor, survival, and status. A peasant family's night might begin with tasks rather than rest. Animals had to be secured. Tools had to be brought in. Embers had to be managed carefully, because fire was both life and danger. A flame could cook food, warm a room, and keep some darkness away. But an uncontrolled spark could destroy not only one house, but a row of houses, a barn, a store of grain, or an entire section of a town. In settlements built from timber, thatch, wattle, and daub, fire was never just a household matter. It was a community threat, so the evening hearth had to be watched, reduced, covered, and controlled. The word curfew itself comes from the idea of covering the fire, from the French couvre-feu. In later usage, it became associated with imposed hours and public order, but at its root was a very physical reality. Flame had to be disciplined before sleep. A medieval night was not safe simply because people went indoors. Safety had to be prepared, and preparation was not equal for everyone. A wealthy household might have candles of better quality, more servants, stronger doors, enclosed chambers, guarded gates, and more reliable fuel. A monastery had its own rhythm of bells, prayers, lamps, dormitories, and night offices. A town had watchmen, gates, rules about movement, and sometimes lamps in particular places. A poor rural household had much less. A rushlight, a dying fire, a small oil lamp, or a cheap tallow candle could give a weak and flickering light. Wax candles were cleaner and brighter, but expensive enough to carry social meaning. Light itself was part of the hierarchy. That detail matters because medieval darkness was not evenly distributed. The rich could buy more protection from it. The poor had to negotiate with it. A candle sounds simple until we remember what it was made from. A cheaper tallow candle, often made from animal fat, could smoke, sputter, and smell unpleasant. It did not create the clean, steady glow we imagine from modern decorative candles. Could drip, could need attention. It could cast uneasy shadows across beams, faces, pots, hanging cloth, and rough walls. A rushlight, made by soaking the pith of a rush in fat or grease, could be economical, but it burned down steadily and had to be used with care. In a world where fuel, fat, wax, and oil all had value, light was not something to waste. This meant that many people did not simply stay awake for long, bright evenings indoors. After dark, activity narrowed. Some work continued, especially in households with urgent tasks, winter needs, textile labor, food preparation, childbirth, illness, or religious obligation. But for many, the dark encouraged sleep, or at least rest. Not because medieval people were more naturally peaceful, but because night made extended activity expensive and inconvenient. Yet sleep itself was not quite what many modern people assume. There is evidence that in pre-industrial Europe, sleep was often divided into what later writers called a first sleep and a second sleep. People might sleep for a period after nightfall, wake for an interval in the middle of the night, and then sleep again until morning. This pattern was not universal in every place or every household, and historians continue to treat it with care, but the basic idea is important. Before artificial lighting reshaped evening life, the night could have a different structure. Waking in the dark was not necessarily a medical problem or a personal failure. It might be part of the rhythm. That waking interval could be used in different ways. Some people prayed. Some tended the fire. Some checked animals. Some spoke quietly. Some engaged in intimacy. Some reflected, worried, or simply lay still listening to the house. In monasteries and religious communities, waking at night could be formalized into prayer and liturgy. In ordinary homes, it could be more informal, shaped by exhaustion, season, weather, hunger, illness, and fear. Here, the medieval night becomes more intimate and more unsettling at the same time. Imagine waking not to a glowing clock or the hum of electricity, but to darkness with texture, the breathing of others nearby, the small noises of animals, the settling of wood, rain against thatch, wind pressing at shutters, a child turning, a cough, a coal shifting under ash, perhaps a distant dog, perhaps a bell. Bells were among the most important sounds in medieval timekeeping. They marked prayer, labor, danger, death, assembly, warning, and routine. A bell did not merely tell the time. It organized the moral and social life of a community. At night, a bell could be comforting because it meant order still existed, but it could also be alarming depending on when and why it sounded. Fire, attack, death, or emergency could all break into the night through sound before anyone understood what was happening. The medieval ear was trained differently from ours. Today, many people sleep through mechanical noise, traffic, distant sirens, heating systems, refrigerators, and the dull electronic murmur of buildings. Medieval people lived among different noises. Animals, bells, tools, weather, carts, voices, fire, wood, insects, and the human body. Silence, when it came, was not always reassuring. Could mean peace. Could also mean that everyone was listening. In towns, night had its own rules. Gates could be closed. Movement could be restricted. Watchmen might patrol, call the hour, or challenge those moving after dark. Inns, taverns, workshops, and market areas changed character. The daytime town, with its bargaining and labor, narrowed into guarded thresholds and suspicious movement. A person outside at night might need a reason. After dark, identity itself became harder to prove. In weak light, a stranger was more dangerous because he was less legible. This is one reason medieval authorities cared so much about nighttime disorder. Not because everyone politely slept until dawn, but because night created opportunity. Theft, violence, illicit meetings, drunkenness, gambling, and forbidden movement all became harder to supervise. The same darkness that frightened honest householders also protected those who wanted to move unseen. But again, the deeper story is not simply medieval night was dangerous. That is too flat. The more interesting truth is that medieval night exposed the limits of community control. Daytime society depended on being seen. People knew one another's faces, clothing, tools, animals, habits, and social positions. Reputation was public. Labor was public. Worship was public. Market life was public. At night, visibility weakened, and with it weakened the ordinary mechanisms that told people who belonged, who was suspicious, who was respectable, and who was out of place. This was especially true in places without strong artificial lighting. A figure at the edge of a lane was not simply a figure. It was a question. A sound near a barn was not simply a sound. It was a possibility. A knock at the door after dark might bring help, danger, news, obligation, or fear. The unsettling quality of medieval night came partly from this. It multiplied meanings. And then there was the sky. For medieval Christians, the night sky was not empty space in the modern scientific sense. It belonged to a created cosmos, layered with religious meaning, astrological interpretation, seasonal signs, and moral imagination. Stars, comets, eclipses, and unusual lights could be read as signs, warnings, wonders, or disturbances. Learned scholars, clerics, physicians, and astrologers had different ways of interpreting celestial patterns, and ordinary people had their own inherited expectations and fears. The heavens were beautiful, but they were not neutral. To stand outside at night in the Middle Ages was to stand beneath a universe that seemed communicative. The moon shaped travel, work, and perception. Full moonlight could make certain tasks possible and certain journeys less frightening. A moonless night could be profoundly dark. Clouds could erase the sky and compress the world down to a few steps ahead. Winter darkness lasted long and pressed heavily on households with limited fuel. Summer nights were shorter, but could bring their own sounds, smells, insects, and movement. Season mattered enormously. A medieval winter night was not merely colder than a summer night. It was socially different. People gathered more tightly around heat. Food stores mattered. Animals needed protection. Roads became harder. Illness could feel more threatening. Darkness arrived early and stayed. In northern regions, long winter nights could stretch into a kind of endurance, with warmth, light, and food all bound together. A summer night, by contrast, might be active in different ways. Heat could make interiors uncomfortable. Agricultural demands could stretch waking hours. Travelers might use cooler parts of the day or evening. But summer also brought noises. Insects, animals, human movement, and the smell of fields, waste, damp earth, and bodies living close together. The medieval night was not one experience. It changed with weather, class, region, season, and work. And smell is something we should not ignore. Modern portrayals of the past often mention smell only to shock the viewer, as though medieval people lived in one continuous cloud of filth. That is not helpful. Medieval people were not unaware of bad smells, nor were they indifferent to cleanliness. They had their own practices, standards, and concerns, but their material environment was different. Smoke, animals, sweat, damp straw, cooking, stored food, waste, leather, wool, wood, rushes, and earth all shaped the atmosphere of indoor life. At night, when doors were closed, people gathered, fires smoked, and air moved less freely. The interior of a house could become heavy. This heaviness affected sleep. A room might be warm near the fire and cold near the walls. Bedding might be rough, shared, or alive with insects. Straw mattresses had to be maintained. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were not rare inconveniences. They were part of bodily life for many. The darkness could make the body more noticeable. Itching, coughing, hunger, tooth pain, stiffness, cold feet, the weight of another sleeper, the sound of someone turning beside you. There is a quiet irony here. We often think of medieval nights as empty because there was less technology. But in the body, the household, the imagination, and the surrounding environment, medieval night could feel crowded. Crowded with people, animals, obligations, beliefs, sounds, and uncertainties. Even the bed itself carried social meaning. The grand beds of the wealthy, with hangings and enclosed forms, were not merely decorative. Curtains could preserve warmth, provide a degree of privacy, and display status. In elite households, sleeping arrangements could still be less private than modern luxury would suggest. Servants might sleep nearby. Attendants might be present. Chambers could be shared or multifunctional. Privacy was not absent, but it was distributed according to rank, gender, space, and wealth. For the poor, a bed was often not a private island of rest. It might be shared by several people. It might be close to stored goods, work materials, or domestic animals. It might not even be a bed in the modern sense. Sleeping could happen on straw, mats, benches, pallets, or shared bedding. What mattered was warmth and survival more than solitude. This changes how we should imagine fear at night. Fear was not always a person alone in a dark room. Sometimes it was a family awake together because something sounded wrong. Sometimes it was a mother listening to a sick child breathe. Sometimes it was an old man worrying over the grain supply. Sometimes it was a servant sleeping lightly because the household might call. Sometimes it was a traveler in an inn, surrounded by strangers, guarding his belongings under uncertain light. The inn deserves its own careful attention, because for medieval travelers, night away from home could be especially unsettling. Travel in the Middle Ages was more common than people sometimes assume. Pilgrims, merchants, messengers, soldiers, clerics, students, laborers, officials, and wanderers all moved across roads and waterways. But travel did not mean comfort. Roads varied in quality. Weather could ruin plans. Lodging could be crowded, noisy, expensive, or unsafe. Sharing space with strangers was ordinary, and privacy was limited. Arriving at an inn after dark could bring relief, but not necessarily peace. There might be animals in the yard, carts, shouting, smoke, food smells, drinking, bargaining, suspicion, and the constant problem of belongings. A traveler had to think about his horse, purse, cloak, documents, tools, and reputation. A woman traveling, especially without strong protection or recognized status, faced additional dangers and scrutiny. Night magnified vulnerability because it reduced witnesses and narrowed options. But it would be wrong to imagine every medieval night as terror. Many nights were ordinary. People slept. People prayed. People whispered. People woke and slept again. The repeated routines of night gave people habits, and habits create familiarity. A person who knew the creak of his own roof, the pattern of dogs in the village, the sound of nearby water, and the ordinary movements of animals did not experience every noise as a supernatural warning. Medieval people were capable of practical judgment. They were not permanently trembling in the dark. The unsettling quality came from the edge between familiarity and uncertainty. Most nights might pass as expected, but the possibility of disruption was always present, and the tools for responding were limited. A sick child could worsen before morning. A fire could spread. A thief could force a door. Wolves or other predators, in some regions and periods, could threaten livestock and sometimes people's imaginations more than their bodies. A storm could damage roofs. A bell could signal danger. A dream could linger with moral or spiritual weight. Dreams, in fact, were not always dismissed as meaningless. Medieval dream interpretation drew from biblical stories, classical inheritance, folk belief, monastic caution, and learned debate. Some dreams were thought to be bodily, caused by food, illness, or imbalance. Others might be temptations, warnings, divine messages, or deceptions. The sleeping mind was not sealed off from the moral universe. Night did not merely cover the body. It opened a space where visions, fears, memories, and spiritual anxieties could move. This helps explain why the boundary between sleep and wakefulness mattered. The half-waking hours of the night, when a person stirred in dimness and could not fully separate dream from sound, were especially charged. A nightmare, a noise outside, and a remembered sermon could combine into one atmosphere. The mind did not need to invent a monster for the night to feel strange. It only needed uncertainty, darkness, and a worldview in which unseen forces were taken seriously. And this brings us to one of the deepest differences between medieval night and our own. Modern darkness is often a failure of infrastructure. A power cut, a broken streetlight, a dead phone battery. Medieval darkness was not a failure. It was the normal condition of half of life. People did not expect to abolish it. They organized themselves around it. They built habits, prayers, laws, and stories around the fact that darkness returned every evening. They learned when to move and when not to move. They measured risks by moonlight, weather, distance, and company. They understood that light was costly. They knew that a door mattered, that embers mattered, that a dog's bark mattered, that a bell in the night mattered. So when we ask why medieval nights felt so strange and unsettling, the answer is not simply superstition. It is not simply poverty. It is not simply danger. It is the combination of all three with something even more basic. The world became harder to interpret after sunset. A field by day was labor. By night it was distance and shadow. A road by day was connection. By night it was exposure. A house by day was work and household order. By night, it was warmth, smoke, bodies, dreams, and listening. A church bell by day was routine. By night, it could be prayer, warning, or death. And beneath all of it was the awareness that human control was thinner than daylight made it seem. This is where the medieval night becomes more than a setting. It becomes a way of understanding the limits of medieval life. The day revealed the social world. Rank, labor, duty, law, and reputation. The night revealed dependence. On fire, on neighbors, on walls, on animals, on God, on habit, and on the fragile hope that morning would arrive without disaster. But to understand the full strangeness of these nights, we have to move even closer. Not just into the house, or the road, or the town gate, but into the actual hours between sunset and dawn. The hours when people locked doors, covered fires, whispered prayers, watched shadows move across walls, and learned to live with a darkness that was never completely empty. Those hours between sunset and dawn were not experienced as one continuous stretch of darkness. They unfolded in stages, each with its own rhythms, expectations, and quiet calculations. The moment the last traces of daylight disappeared over the fields was different from the deep hours around midnight, and those were different again from the pale uncertainty that came just before dawn. Medieval people learned these subtle changes through repetition. Their lives depended upon recognizing them. In many villages, the evening began with one final burst of activity. Doors were checked once more. Animals were counted. A child might be sent to fetch another armful of firewood before complete darkness settled in. Someone might carry a bucket of water indoors, not simply for drinking, but because venturing outside again later would be inconvenient, uncomfortable, or occasionally unsafe. These were small actions, but they reveal something important about medieval life. Every unnecessary journey into the darkness carried a cost. Unlike the modern home, where electric light encourages movement from room to room without much thought, medieval households often concentrated themselves into the warmest, brightest corner available. The hearth was more than a fireplace. It was the center of conversation, cooking, repair work, storytelling, and comfort. Once darkness settled outside, much of the household's world contracted to the reach of the firelight. That shrinking of space had psychological consequences. A room illuminated by a single flame behaves differently from one filled with electric light. Corners disappear into shadow. Faces become partly illuminated and partly hidden. Every movement creates shifting patterns across timber beams and plaster walls. Objects hanging from pegs, a cloak, a bundle of herbs, a cooking pot, could briefly resemble something entirely different as the flame flickered. Today, our eyes rarely spend much time adjusting to true darkness. Artificial lighting follows us almost everywhere. Medieval eyes, by contrast, constantly adapted to changing levels of illumination. People knew how much the moon revealed, how much cloud cover concealed, and how quickly their vision improved after remaining outdoors for several minutes. They possessed forms of practical night knowledge that most modern people have never needed to acquire. This familiarity, however, did not remove uncertainty. Instead, it sharpened awareness. Someone stepping outside late in the evening would pause naturally, allowing their eyesight to adjust. During those first moments, nearly everything appeared black. Gradually, shapes emerged: the outline of a fence, the pale trunk of a birch tree, the roofline of a neighboring cottage, the faint shimmer of dew catching moonlight. Distance returned slowly. That gradual revealing of the landscape often influenced how medieval people interpreted what they saw. A shape that first appeared threatening frequently resolved into something ordinary. A bush became a sheep. A standing figure became an old tree stump. A strange movement turned out to be branches shifting in the wind. Yet sometimes the opposite occurred. Something that seemed harmless from a distance slowly revealed itself to be another traveler, an unfamiliar horse, or someone waiting beside the road. It was this uncertainty, not constant danger, that shaped the emotional character of medieval knights. Our own imaginations tend to insert certainty where medieval people often experienced ambiguity. Take something as simple as footsteps. In a modern apartment building, footsteps outside the door usually belong to neighbors. On a suburban street, they may be someone walking a dog. Their meaning is fairly limited. In a small medieval village after dark, footsteps could mean many different things. A returning family member, a neighbor seeking help, someone carrying urgent news, the village watch, a traveler asking for shelter, a thief testing doors, or someone whose intentions remained impossible to know until voices were exchanged. Sound, therefore, became one of the most important senses after sunset. Long before a person became visible, they became audible. The crunch of gravel, the splash of boots crossing a shallow ford, the slow creak of wagon wheels, the clatter of loose harness, the distant barking of dogs responding to someone approaching from beyond the fields. Every experienced villager unconsciously learned to distinguish these sounds. A horse ridden quickly at night was unusual enough to draw attention. Someone knocking repeatedly instead of calling out immediately might raise concern. The silence following barking dogs could be almost as informative as the barking itself. Modern historians sometimes describe medieval communities as intensely local, and nighttime illustrates exactly why. People knew the normal sounds of their own settlement remarkably well. They recognized which family's cart squeaked, which neighbor habitually rose before dawn, which farmhouse kept geese that complained loudly whenever strangers approached. When something sounded unfamiliar, it stood out immediately. This deep familiarity also helps explain why strangers attracted so much attention. During daylight, an unfamiliar traveler could be observed openly. His clothing might reveal occupation or wealth. His horse might suggest social standing. His accent might hint at where he had come from. Other villagers were present. Questions could be asked naturally. At night, those opportunities disappeared. Darkness concealed details that communities normally relied upon to judge trustworthiness. Ironically, the same lack of information that worried ordinary people also protected legitimate travelers. Pilgrims making long journeys often depended upon monasteries, hospitals, and charitable institutions willing to offer shelter before darkness became complete. The timing mattered enormously. A traveler arriving shortly before sunset could still be evaluated. Someone arriving long after darkness had introduced uncertainty into everyone else's evening. Hospitality remained an important Christian virtue throughout medieval Europe. Yet hospitality was balanced against caution. The ideal host welcomed the stranger. The prudent householder also protected family and property. These values occasionally pulled against one another, particularly after nightfall. Many surviving legal customs, local regulations, and household advice reveal this delicate balance. Doors were not simply barriers. They were thresholds where charity, suspicion, necessity, and reputation all met. Refusing assistance to someone genuinely in need might weigh heavily upon the conscience. Opening the household to the wrong visitor carried obvious practical risks. The decision rarely felt simple. Night also transformed familiar landscapes into places of memory. Many medieval roads passed ancient burial grounds, ruined Roman buildings, abandoned settlements, old standing stones, forgotten earthworks, and weathered crosses. Modern archaeology identifies these places through excavation. Medieval people often encountered them through inherited stories. Not every tale was believed literally. Just as today people enjoy local legends without accepting every detail, medieval communities varied enormously in what individuals believed. Nevertheless, landscapes accumulated reputations. Certain crossroads became associated with crime. Particular woods gained reputations for becoming disorienting after sunset, Urgent travelers occasionally arrived late. Messages still needed carrying. Medical emergencies ignored daylight. Storms sometimes forced unexpected crossings. Operating a ferry in darkness demanded intimate familiarity with currents invisible beneath black water. Landmarks disappeared. Riverbanks blended together. The ferryman often relied upon memory, sound, and the subtle feel of moving water against the boat. Such knowledge accumulated slowly over decades, could not easily be written down. It belonged to experience. Across medieval Europe, countless forms of practical expertise developed precisely because darkness changed ordinary tasks into specialized ones. Bakers, too, often began their work while others slept. In many towns, ovens were fired long before dawn so fresh bread would be ready by morning markets. A baker's night was measured not by stars but by heat. The great oven demanded careful preparation. Wood burned differently depending upon species, dryness, and weather. The masonry retained warmth for hours. Too much heat ruined bread. Too little produced disappointing loaves. The baker judged temperatures through observation, experience, and instinct rather than thermometers. While much of the town remained asleep, flames already illuminated workshops where the next day's food quietly began to take shape. This reminds us that medieval darkness did not stop production. It merely shifted certain kinds of labor into hours few people witnessed. Blacksmiths occasionally worked late when urgent repairs became necessary. Physicians might be summoned unexpectedly. Midwives frequently found themselves walking unfamiliar paths beneath moonlight because childbirth refused to obey convenient schedules. Their journeys reveal another overlooked aspect of medieval night. Women, despite common assumptions, were certainly present after dark under particular circumstances. A midwife called urgently to another household could become one of the few people regularly moving through sleeping villages at midnight. She often carried practical knowledge valued across every social class. Birth could not wait until sunrise, nor could death. The priest summoned to administer the last rites likewise entered the nighttime landscape under circumstances filled with urgency. A lantern moving quickly through empty streets announced that someone, somewhere nearby, hovered between life and death. Neighbors noticing that light might quietly understand its destination without anyone speaking. These silent recognitions formed part of communal life. Everyone knew that one day the lantern might stop at their own door. Night therefore carried emotional weight beyond fear. It became the setting for life's most vulnerable moments. Birth, illness, death, prayer, confession, farewell. The darkness witnessed events that daylight often concealed beneath ordinary activity. Even royalty experienced nighttime differently than modern audiences often imagine. Great castles appear imposing during daylight, but after sunset they became complicated worlds of limited illumination. Torches and candles softened rather than banished darkness. Long corridors faded into shadow. Stone staircases echoed with footsteps. Curtains shifted slightly in drafts. Servants remained awake in various parts of the household while nobles retired behind chamber doors. Security relied upon gatekeepers, guards, locked doors, trusted retainers, and dogs rather than brilliant illumination. Castles certainly offered greater protection than peasant cottages. Yet they were not brightly lit fortresses glowing through the night. Fuel remained expensive. Candles required replacement. Even kings lived within the practical limits imposed by medieval lighting technology. This limitation shaped architecture itself. Windows often remained relatively small, especially in defensive structures. Large glass panes were costly. Shutters retained warmth. Heavy walls trapped heat while simultaneously limiting available light. The result was interiors that changed dramatically with the setting sun. A great hall bustling during daylight acquired an entirely different atmosphere once candles became its primary illumination. The familiar space seemed larger. Ceilings disappeared into darkness. Voices echoed differently. Movement slowed. One curious consequence of this limited lighting was the increased importance of memory. Modern people unconsciously rely upon abundant visual information. We glance at clocks, labels, screens, signs, street numbers, illuminated exits, and distant buildings almost continuously. Medieval people depended more heavily upon remembering where objects belonged because finding them after dark could prove frustrating. A misplaced knife, a forgotten bucket, tool left outside, a missing key. Each became far more troublesome once visibility disappeared. Households therefore developed habits that minimized unnecessary searching. Routine was not merely comforting. It was efficient. Order inside the home reduced confusion after sunset. Children learned where things belonged because everyone benefited. In this sense, darkness quietly encouraged discipline. Not discipline imposed through punishment alone, but discipline emerging from practical necessity. The household that consistently returned tools to familiar places functioned more smoothly when light became scarce. The same principle extended into larger communities. Town gates closed at expected hours. Church bells followed established patterns. Markets opened predictably. Agricultural work followed seasonal rhythms. Night reinforced regularity because disorder became harder to manage once visibility vanished. Yet despite every effort to organize life around these realities, surprises continued to occur. A sudden storm, an escaped animal, an unexpected visitor, smoke seen rising beyond neighboring rooftops, the unmistakable smell of something burning. Among all nighttime dangers, fire remained perhaps the most feared, not because it occurred constantly, but because its consequences spread so quickly. Imagine waking not to an alarm but to shouting, someone outside calling urgently, dogs barking, church bells ringing rapidly rather than steadily, neighbors already carrying buckets toward an orange glow growing against the darkness. At night, flames possessed terrifying visibility. A single burning roof could illuminate an entire street. What had been invisible moments earlier suddenly emerged in flickering detail. Faces, rooftops, smoke, frightened livestock, hurried figures passing water from hand to hand. Communities practiced cooperation because no household could fight such disasters alone. Even people who rarely spoke during ordinary weeks might find themselves standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the same burning roof. Fire reminded everyone that medieval settlements existed through mutual dependence. The same closeness that spread danger also spread survival. These moments also reveal something else about medieval nights. Darkness magnified human voices. Commands carried farther. Prayers became louder. Instructions moved from person to person across narrow streets. The community became temporarily united by necessity. Then, when the danger finally passed, silence returned slowly. Buckets were set down. Smoke drifted into the cooling air. Families counted losses. Others quietly gave thanks. The watch resumed its rounds. The baker continued tending his oven. The monastery prepared for another office of prayer. The shepherd listened once more to the breathing of his flock. And above them all, the stars continued their slow movement across the sky, indifferent to the brief emergencies unfolding beneath them. Yet beyond the villages, monasteries, castles, and market towns stretched another landscape altogether. A landscape where roads disappeared into forests, marshes, hills, and lonely stretches of countryside that acquired very different meanings once the last familiar light had vanished from view. Yet beyond the villages, monasteries, castles, and market towns stretched another landscape altogether. a landscape where roads disappeared into forests, marshes, hills, and lonely stretches of countryside that acquired very different meanings once the last familiar light had vanished from view. To modern eyes, a medieval road often appears straightforward on a map. A thin line connects one settlement to another, suggesting that travel was simply a matter of following the route. But maps flatten experience. They cannot easily capture how profoundly the character of a road changed after sunset. By daylight, a country lane revealed its landmarks one after another. A lone oak tree marked the halfway point to the next village. A stream curved beneath a wooden bridge. A wayside cross stood where travelers often paused to pray. Fields opened into commons before narrowing again between hedgerows. Every feature quietly reassured the traveler that they remained on the correct path. At night, many of those reassuring details dissolved. The great oak became only a darker shape against an already dark horizon. The stream announced itself first by sound rather than sight. The wooden bridge emerged almost unexpectedly beneath one's feet. A familiar bend in the road might appear strangely unfamiliar when every field beyond it had disappeared into shadow. This explains why experienced travelers often preferred company whenever possible. Companionship did more than discourage robbery. It multiplied perception. One traveler might notice the road beginning to soften beneath recent rain. Another might hear water flowing where the path should continue. Someone walking beside a horse might recognize an unusual smell drifting from nearby marshland, warning that fog was likely to thicken before long. Knowledge was shared continuously. A solitary traveler possessed only one pair of eyes and ears. A small group carried several. Medieval roads were also far less standardized than modern highways. Maintenance depended upon local resources, seasonal conditions, and political authority. Some stretches remained reasonably well kept because merchants used them regularly or because powerful monasteries and towns benefited from reliable transport. Others deteriorated quickly after heavy rain, becoming deeply rutted or nearly impassable during certain seasons. Darkness concealed these changes. A wagon while dropping unexpectedly into an unseen rut might break an axle miles from assistance, that a horse could stumble on loose stones hidden beneath fallen leaves. Even a simple ankle injury became far more serious when the nearest settlement lay several hours away and daylight was still distant. Such risks help explain another feature of medieval travel that sometimes surprises modern audiences. People frequently plan journeys around available daylight rather than total distance. A traveler might deliberately stop at an inn while several hours of daylight still remained, choosing certainty over attempting another village before darkness fell. This was not laziness. It was often careful judgment. Missing the expected stopping place by only an hour could mean spending the remainder of the night exposed on unfamiliar roads. Season altered these calculations constantly. Summer granted long evenings. Merchants could travel farther before stopping. Pilgrims sometimes covered considerable distances during favorable weather. Winter imposed different limits. Short days compressed opportunity. The same journey might require additional overnight stops simply because usable daylight disappeared so much earlier. In Northern Europe especially, the length of winter nights transformed travel into an exercise in careful planning rather than optimistic endurance. Weather remained the great uncertainty. Medieval travelers watched the sky with remarkable attention because clouds, wind direction, temperature, and humidity all carried practical meaning. A clear evening did not always remain clear. Mist rising from rivers could spread across valleys with surprising speed. Moonlight, so helpful only moments earlier, vanished behind thick cloud. Roads that had seemed comfortably visible became little more than faint impressions beneath one's feet. Fog deserves particular attention because it altered sound as much as sight. Voices became strangely muffled. Distant noises seemed closer than they truly were. Nearby objects appeared suddenly without warning. A church bell that normally served as a reassuring landmark might seem to drift across the landscape without revealing its actual location. For someone unfamiliar with the terrain, this could become deeply disorienting. Yet experienced local people often continued moving with quiet confidence. Their certainty reminds us once again that medieval knowledge frequently depended less upon written instruction than repeated experience. They recognized the smell of particular marshes. They knew which valleys trapped morning mist. They remembered where water gathered after autumn rains. They understood how certain hills caught the first light of dawn. This intimate familiarity with landscape cannot easily be separated from the emotional experience of night. People feared unknown places more than known ones. The same woodland that frightened an unfamiliar traveler might feel almost comforting to the charcoal burner or forester who had worked there for decades. Forests themselves occupied a complicated place within medieval imagination. Modern films often portray them as endlessly dark, dangerous wildernesses inhabited almost exclusively by outlaws and wolves. Reality was more nuanced. Many forests were working landscapes. Woodcutters harvested timber. Swineherds drove pigs among oak trees during autumn to feed upon fallen acorns. Hunters pursued game according to local rights and restrictions. Monasteries managed woodland resources carefully. Villagers gathered firewood where permitted. Children sometimes collected berries, mushrooms, or nuts. The forest was neither untouched wilderness nor completely domesticated space. It existed somewhere between. Nevertheless, night altered even familiar woods. The canopy reduced moonlight. Tree trunks interrupted visibility. Branches shifted continuously with the wind. Sounds echoed unpredictably. A traveler walking beneath dense woodland after sunset experienced a very different environment from someone crossing open farmland. The darkness became layered. Instead of one broad shadow spread across fields, countless smaller shadows overlapped and moved. Every gust transformed the appearance of the path. Leaves whispered overhead with subtle variations difficult to interpret. Owls called across surprising distances. Foxes barked with cries unfamiliar to those who had never heard them before. Many nocturnal animals produced sounds that remain startling even today. Without modern understanding of wildlife, such noises naturally acquired larger significance. Again, practical observation and inherited belief frequently coexisted. People certainly recognized many ordinary animal calls. Experienced hunters distinguished them with ease. Yet unfamiliar sounds, particularly during storms or breeding seasons, could still encourage speculation. The medieval countryside remained acoustically richer than many urban listeners today might expect. Silence was rarely absolute. Streams flowed. Wind moved continuously through different kinds of vegetation. Insects filled summer evenings. Frogs gathered near wetlands. Birds announced dawn long before sunrise. The countryside possessed its own nighttime conversation. People simply learned which voices belonged there. One fascinating consequence of this rich soundscape was the importance of dogs. Dogs served as remarkably sensitive early warning systems. Farm dogs recognized familiar people through scent and habit. Their reactions varied noticeably depending upon who approached. A relaxed bark differed from sustained alarm. Communities paid attention. A chain of barking dogs moving steadily from one farm to the next effectively tracked someone's progress through the landscape long before they reached the village itself. Without intending to do so, dogs formed part of the medieval communication network. They informed sleeping households that movement continued outside. Not every traveler welcomed this attention. Messengers carrying urgent correspondence occasionally wished to pass unnoticed. Hunters returning late hoped not to disturb entire villages. Young people visiting sweethearts after dark certainly understood the challenge posed by observant farm dogs. The ordinary behavior of animals influenced human routines in countless small ways. The same was true of horses. Anyone traveling after sunset depended enormously upon the horse's own judgment. Unlike modern vehicles, horses constantly interpreted the landscape independently. They noticed unstable ground. They hesitated near unfamiliar obstacles. They reacted to scents beyond human perception. An experienced rider often trusted these reactions rather than forcing the animal forward blindly. The relationship between horse and rider therefore became especially important at night. The horse contributed perception as well as transport. This partnership appears repeatedly in medieval accounts of travel, military campaigns, and pilgrimage. Animals were collaborators rather than simple machines. Another subtle but revealing feature of nighttime travel involved clothing. Heavy wool cloaks served purposes extending beyond warmth. They protected against dew. They reduced the chilling effects of wind. They shielded expensive garments beneath from dirt and light rain. A hood limited heat loss while also narrowing peripheral vision. This trade-off mattered. Keeping warm could mean seeing less of one's surroundings. Travelers constantly balanced comfort against awareness. Footwear created similar compromises. Leather boots protected feet but became heavy when soaked. Wooden clogs functioned well under certain muddy conditions yet proved awkward elsewhere. Even the choice of shoes influenced how confidently someone could continue after dark. These practical realities gradually accumulated into emotional experience. Night felt unsettling partly because every decision carried slightly greater consequences. A wrong turning cost more time. Wet clothing became more uncomfortable. A broken strap mattered more. A forgotten waterskin became harder to replace. Darkness magnified inconvenience into genuine difficulty. One surprisingly important source of reassurance came from smell. Human beings often underestimate the usefulness of scent because modern environments are comparatively controlled. Medieval landscapes possess stronger and more varied odors. Fresh-cut hay, with smoke drifting from distant cottages. The damp scent of rivers. Salt carried inland from coastal winds. The unmistakable smell of livestock. Even when landmarks disappeared visually, familiar scents sometimes revealed proximity to inhabited places. A traveler catching the smell of wood smoke after hours of darkness might reasonably hope that shelter lay nearby. Likewise, experienced fishermen approaching coastal settlements during darkness often recognized changing sea air long before seeing the shoreline. The senses continually compensated for one another. Perhaps nowhere was this more evident than beneath a full moon. Modern lighting has made it difficult for many people to appreciate just how bright moonlight can become in rural landscapes. Historical observers frequently remarked upon nights bright enough to cast shadows. Open fields reflected pale light remarkably well. Snow increased brightness dramatically. Under favorable conditions, experienced travelers could navigate surprisingly effectively. The moon therefore possessed practical importance extending far beyond poetry. Its phases influenced planning. Farmers noticed them. Sailors observed them. Travelers respected them. Communities without printed calendars often remained acutely aware of the lunar cycle because it affected ordinary life so directly. Yet moonlight also created one of the great visual paradoxes of medieval night. It illuminated enough to reveal the landscape, but not enough to explain everything within it. Distance became deceptive. Shadows stretched unnaturally long. Colors nearly vanished, leaving the world composed primarily of silver, gray, and black. Objects appeared flatter from one angle and strangely three-dimensional from another. A person standing motionless beside a tree might remain unnoticed until unexpectedly close. A pale boulder could resemble an animal. Mist crossing open fields reflected moonlight so brightly that it seemed almost solid. This partial visibility often proved more unsettling than complete darkness. Absolute darkness admitted ignorance. Moonlight encouraged uncertain interpretation. The mind naturally attempted to complete incomplete images. This tendency is deeply human and not unique to the Middle Ages. Modern people experience the same instinct while driving through heavy fog or walking unfamiliar streets at night. The difference is that medieval people encountered these conditions far more frequently because artificial illumination rarely overwhelmed the natural environment. As the hours continued, however, another quiet transformation began. The deepest part of the night eventually yielded to subtle changes almost impossible to detect at first. The air shifted. Some nocturnal sounds gradually diminished. Others emerged for the first time. The eastern horizon remained dark, yet experienced observers already sensed that the longest hours were beginning to loosen their hold. For countless generations, people whose lives depended upon fields, roads, rivers, monasteries, and marketplaces learned to recognize these nearly invisible signs long before the first hint of daylight became visible. And it was during those delicate moments before dawn that medieval night revealed perhaps its most remarkable transition of all. It was during those delicate moments before dawn that medieval night revealed perhaps its most remarkable transition of all. The coming of morning was rarely sudden. There was no instant when darkness simply disappeared and day took its place. Instead, the medieval observer experienced a gradual unfolding that rewarded careful attention. Long before the sun itself appeared above the horizon, the world began to change in almost imperceptible ways. For those whose livelihoods depended upon reading the natural environment, these quiet signals carried practical importance every single day. One of the first changes was often not visual at all. It was the air. The deepest hours of the night usually carried a certain stillness, especially under clear skies. As dawn approached, subtle movements of cooler and warmer air altered the atmosphere. Mist gathered differently over rivers. Dew settled heavily across meadows. Smoke rising from a banked hearth behaved differently as temperatures shifted. Farmers, shepherds, fishermen, and foresters noticed these patterns almost unconsciously after years of repetition. Modern meteorology explains many of these changes through atmospheric science. Medieval people explained them through observation. Although they lacked our vocabulary, they often possessed extraordinary familiarity with recurring local conditions. A shepherd might predict morning fog simply because the previous evening's wind had arrived from a familiar direction. A fisherman might decide whether to launch before sunrise by smelling the changing air drifting inland from the sea. Their conclusions emerged from accumulated experience rather than formal theory. This distinction is important. Knowledge does not become valuable only after it acquires scientific terminology. The medieval countryside was filled with practical experts whose understanding came through thousands of ordinary mornings. The birds often noticed dawn before people did. Anyone who has spent time in quiet rural places knows that birds do not all begin singing simultaneously. Different species awaken at different moments, producing what modern naturalists sometimes call the dawn chorus. Medieval listeners would not have used that expression, but they certainly experienced the phenomenon. The silence slowly fractured. First one call, then another. Soon several different voices overlapped. The darkness itself remained, yet the landscape no longer sounded asleep. This gradual return of birdsong carried emotional weight as well as practical meaning. For someone who had spent anxious hours traveling through unfamiliar country, hearing the first birds often brought genuine relief. The most uncertain portion of the journey had nearly passed. Visibility would soon improve. Other travelers would begin appearing. Farmhouses would wake. Roads would gradually return to ordinary life. The emotional transition from night to morning often began through sound before it arrived through sight. Domestic animals participated in this transformation too. Roosters occupy an almost legendary place in medieval imagination, but the familiar image contains more truth than exaggeration. Roosters did indeed become reliable markers of approaching dawn, though not with perfect precision. Their calls varied with season, weather, and local conditions. More broadly, entire farmyards slowly returned to activity. Horses shifted inside stables. Cattle stirred. Dogs became alert as household members began moving. Geese announced almost everything with impressive enthusiasm. The sleeping settlement gradually rediscovered its own voice. These sounds reflected something deeper than simple biology. They marked the return of human control. Throughout the night, people had largely adapted themselves to darkness. As dawn approached, they prepared once again to shape the landscape actively rather than merely endure it. Doors opened. Smoke rose more steadily from chimneys. Water buckets reappeared along paths leading toward wells and streams. The world expanded. Perhaps nowhere was this expansion more noticeable than inside the medieval household. The room that had seemed compressed around a single hearth gradually regained its full dimensions. Corners emerged. Stored tools became visible again. Furniture resumed familiar shapes. Objects that had required careful searching during candlelight suddenly became obvious. It is easy to underestimate how reassuring this simple return of visibility must have been. We live among constant illumination and therefore rarely notice the emotional comfort provided by ordinary sight. For medieval people, daylight represented certainty. It restored confidence in familiar surroundings. What had looked strange by moonlight usually returned to its ordinary appearance without ceremony. The hanging cloak became simply a cloak again. The shadow behind the storage chest disappeared. The yard outside no longer concealed unexpected shapes. This daily restoration quietly reinforced trust in the world. Every sunrise corrected countless small misunderstandings created by darkness. Yet dawn also exposed what the night had accomplished. Fresh footprints in mud might reveal that someone had indeed passed the house after midnight. A damaged fence showed where livestock had escaped. Storm winds might have scattered roofing straw across the yard. Frozen water buckets revealed unexpectedly cold temperatures. The landscape itself carried evidence of events that had unfolded while most people slept. In this sense, morning became an investigation. People read the signs left behind. Had foxes entered the henhouse? Did wolves approach the pasture during the night, even if they never attacked? Had travelers stopped at the roadside cross? Did heavy rain wash away part of the path? The first hours after sunrise often answered questions that had remained unresolved in darkness. For farmers, these inspections quickly became routine. Agriculture rewarded constant observation. Every morning offered new information. The condition of crops, the health of animals, the amount of moisture in the soil, damage caused by weather, unexpected growth, signs of disease. A medieval farmer began each day not simply by working but by assessing. The landscape communicated continuously to anyone patient enough to notice. That habit of observation shaped medieval thinking more broadly than we sometimes recognize. Because so much depended upon direct experience, people learned to notice small changes. Cloud patterns, animal behavior, water levels, the smell of damp earth, the texture of frost beneath boots. These details rarely appeared in official chronicles because they belonged to ordinary life rather than dramatic events. Yet they occupied thousands of hours every year. History often remembers kings and battles. Daily existence depended just as much upon whether dew lingered unusually long on a spring morning. Markets likewise emerged gradually from the remains of night. Merchants who had arrived before dawn unloaded carts while visibility improved. Bakers displayed warm bread whose preparation had begun hours earlier. Fishmongers hurried to sell fresh catches before spoilage. Artisans opened shutters. Children carried messages. Church bells shifted from nocturnal significance toward daytime routine. The settlement breathed outward again. If the night had compressed society into protected interiors, the morning released it back into shared public space. This daily rhythm influenced medieval social relationships profoundly. People met one another repeatedly at predictable moments. Neighbors encountered each other while fetching water. Farmers exchanged observations as they walked toward fields. Craftsmen discussed weather before beginning work. Routine interactions strengthened community because they occurred constantly rather than occasionally. Night interrupted these connections. Morning restored them. There was, however, another side to dawn. For certain people, sunrise did not bring relief. It brought accountability. Someone who had stolen during darkness now faced increasing risk of recognition. Tracks became easier to follow. Witnesses became easier to find. Merchants could compare missing goods. Villagers noticed damaged property. The anonymity offered by darkness faded rapidly beneath daylight. This practical reality shaped medieval law enforcement as much as any written statute. Many investigations began with morning observations. Who had seen unusual movement before sunset? Which horse left distinctive hoofprints? Which gate had been left unsecured? Had unfamiliar travelers passed through recently? Communities combined memory with visible evidence. Although forensic science lay centuries in the future, ordinary people still practiced careful reasoning based upon available clues. Sometimes their conclusions proved correct. Sometimes suspicion fell unfairly upon outsiders or unpopular neighbors. Human judgment has always been imperfect. Nevertheless, the process reminds us that medieval communities relied heavily upon collective observation. The return of daylight allowed evidence to accumulate. Interestingly, medieval literature and religious writing frequently used dawn itself as a symbol of moral clarity. Darkness naturally suggested uncertainty, temptation, ignorance, or hidden dangers. Morning represented revelation, understanding, renewal, and hope. These symbolic meanings resonated precisely because they reflected everyday experience. People did not invent such metaphors randomly. They emerged from repeated contact with the physical world. The transition from darkness to light genuinely altered daily life. Writers simply recognized the emotional power already present within ordinary experience. Still, we should avoid imagining dawn as universally joyful. For laborers, daylight also signaled another long day of demanding work. Fields required attention regardless of fatigue. Craft workshops reopened. Servants resumed duties. Children old enough to contribute returned to household tasks. The same sunrise that comforted travelers also reminded workers that obligations never paused for very long. Life resumed quickly. This rhythm helps explain why medieval people often viewed time somewhat differently from modern societies. Mechanical clocks gradually became more common during the later Middle Ages, especially in towns, but much of life continued to follow natural cycles. The rising sun, church bells, seasonal daylight, weather, agricultural demands, these remained powerful organizers of experience. Time was not merely counted. It was lived through recurring patterns. One morning resembled another in many respects, yet no two were completely identical. The sky changed. The temperature shifted. Visitors arrived unexpectedly. Animals behaved differently. Harvests advanced. Children grew older. The repetition contained endless variation. Night belonged to this same rhythm. It was not an interruption of life but one half of an ongoing cycle. Understanding medieval nights, therefore, requires understanding medieval mornings as well. Each gave meaning to the other. Darkness heightened appreciation for daylight. Daylight restored confidence after uncertainty. Together they created a world whose tempo differed profoundly from our own. And yet, even as villages awakened and fields slowly filled with workers, traces of the night remained visible to those who looked carefully enough. The damp footprints across a courtyard, the half-burned torch abandoned near a gate, fresh wagon ruts leading away before sunrise, a traveler asleep in the corner of an inn after arriving only hours earlier, a watchman finally returning home while everyone else was beginning their day. These quiet reminders reveal another truth about medieval nights. They never ended all at once. Instead, fragments of darkness lingered into daylight through the people whose work, worries, or journeys had carried them across the unseen hours. Among those people were merchants whose livelihoods depended upon reaching distant markets, royal messengers carrying urgent news across kingdoms, pilgrims traveling towards sacred shrines, and countless ordinary men and women whose paths sometimes forced them to confront the medieval night far beyond the reassuring sound of familiar church bells. And it is with those long journeys into the open countryside that the next stage of our story begins. Among those people were merchants whose livelihoods depended upon reaching distant markets, royal messengers carrying urgent news across kingdoms, pilgrims traveling towards sacred shrines, and countless ordinary men and women whose paths sometimes forced them to confront the medieval night far beyond the reassuring sound of familiar church bells. And it is with those long journeys into the open countryside that the next stage of our story begins. For most medieval people, travel was never simply movement from one place to another. It was a careful negotiation with distance, weather, daylight, reputation, and chance. Every successful journey represented dozens of small decisions made correctly. The hour of departure, the choice of road, the companion selected, the amount of food carried, the condition of the horse, the season of the year, even the expectation of where night might fall. All of these shaped whether a journey would become routine or unexpectedly difficult. Night transformed every one of those calculations. A merchant leaving a prosperous market town in late afternoon might appear perfectly comfortable. His pack-horse carried cloth, salt, iron tools, or barrels of ale destined for another settlement perhaps 20 or 30 miles away. He had traveled this route before. He knew the names of inns along the road. He recognized villages where local craftsmen produced dependable goods. Nothing about the journey seemed extraordinary. Yet, as the afternoon shadows lengthened, the questions quietly began. Would the weather remain clear? Had recent rains softened the road beyond the next valley? Would the bridge still be passable? Would there be room at the inn? Would he arrive before the gates of the next town were closed? Unlike many modern journeys, these uncertainties could not simply be solved by checking a timetable or consulting a map. They unfolded gradually. Every mile answered one question while creating another. This slow accumulation of uncertainty explains why experienced travelers valued information almost as highly as food. News passed constantly between people moving in opposite directions. A rider approaching from the east might report that heavy flooding had damaged a bridge 2 days earlier. A group of pilgrims could mention increased bandit activity near a particular forest. A wandering friar might know that a monastery welcomed travelers during difficult weather. These brief conversations became an informal network of intelligence stretching across medieval Europe. In many ways, roads carried information more efficiently than official documents. People trusted first-hand experience. "How is the road ahead?" was among the most practical questions anyone could ask. The answer might change the entire day's plan. One subtle feature of medieval travel often escapes modern attention. People rarely moved through empty landscapes. Even where settlements were widely spaced, the countryside bore continuous evidence of human activity. Fields extended outward from villages. Boundary markers divided properties. Charcoal burners worked deep within woodlands. Mill streams powered water wheels. Wayside chapels offered places for prayer. Roadside crosses commemorated accidents, acts of devotion, or local benefactors. These landmarks reminded travelers that they occupied a lived landscape rather than untouched wilderness. At night, however, these familiar signs became much harder to recognize. A small chapel passed unnoticed in darkness might have offered valuable shelter. A boundary stone disappeared entirely. A fork in the road became surprisingly difficult to identify. One wrong decision might add several hours to a journey already approaching nightfall. Because of this, memory acquired remarkable importance. Experienced merchants frequently carried detailed mental maps rather than written ones. They remembered not merely directions but sequences. After the old oak came the stream. After the stream came the abandoned mill. Beyond the mill, the road climbed gently before bending toward open pasture. This method reflected how people naturally experienced travel. The journey unfolded one landmark at a time. Darkness interrupted that familiar sequence. Remove enough landmarks, and even experienced travelers occasionally doubted themselves. The medieval road therefore demanded humility. Confidence mattered. Overconfidence could become dangerous. This becomes especially clear when we consider the experience of pilgrims. Pilgrimage occupied a unique place within medieval life because religious devotion frequently required ordinary people to undertake journeys far longer than anything they normally attempted. Some traveled only to nearby shrines. Others crossed kingdoms. A fortunate few eventually reached Rome, Jerusalem, or Santiago de Compostela. These travelers accepted discomfort as part of the experience. Blisters, uncertain weather, crowded lodging, poor food, and long days on foot became expected companions. Night added another layer. Unlike merchants, pilgrims often traveled with fewer possessions. Many deliberately embraced simpler living. Their clothing announced both vulnerability and purpose. The familiar pilgrim's staff, broad hat, and satchel carried practical value, but they also communicated identity. A traveler dressed as a pilgrim might receive hospitality from strangers who respected the spiritual nature of the journey. Yet that same appearance also signaled limited wealth. Not every encounter proved generous. Roads brought together people with very different intentions. The medieval world admired pilgrimage. It also contained opportunists willing to exploit it. This tension shaped nighttime behavior. Pilgrims frequently sought company. Traveling in groups reduced loneliness while also providing practical protection. Conversation eased long hours. Shared prayers marked the passing miles. Someone injured could receive assistance. A larger group also discouraged many ordinary criminals, who generally preferred isolated targets. Interestingly, medieval writers often described companionship itself as one of the blessings of pilgrimage. The road created temporary communities. People from different regions, occupations, and social backgrounds walked together for days or weeks. Night strengthened these relationships. After sunset, strangers who had shared the day's journey often shared supper, stories, and sleeping space. The darkness narrowed social distance. Travel itself quietly rearranged ordinary hierarchies. An experienced guide might command more respect than a wealthy merchant unfamiliar with the route. An elderly pilgrim who had completed the journey before possessed valuable knowledge unavailable to younger companions. Skill often outweighed status once daylight disappeared. The practical realities of survival encouraged cooperation. Royal messengers experienced yet another version of medieval night. Unlike pilgrims, they often traveled under pressure. Messages concerning diplomacy, military campaigns, legal disputes, taxation, or royal administration could not always wait until morning. Every hour mattered. Fresh horses stationed at particular locations occasionally allowed especially urgent dispatches to continue through the night. Even so, speed remained limited by terrain, weather, and visibility. The messenger could not command the moon to shine more brightly. He could not persuade flooded rivers to subside. He could not remove fog from the valleys. Authority reached surprisingly ordinary limits after sunset. This serves as a useful reminder that medieval governments operated within the same natural constraints as everyone else. Kings possessed armies. They did not possess electricity. A royal order still depended upon roads, horses, weather, and exhausted human beings carrying written words across difficult landscapes. Night therefore imposed its own quiet equality. Nature ignored political rank. Storms delayed everyone. Fog confused everyone. Cold affected everyone. Of course, wealth could soften many hardships. A noble traveler usually enjoyed better equipment, stronger horses, and more comfortable lodging than an ordinary laborer. But no amount of wealth could transform midnight into noon. Darkness remained fundamentally democratic. It reduced visibility for rich and poor alike. One aspect of medieval travel deserves particular attention because it reveals how deeply people adapted to natural rhythms. Many travelers became remarkably skilled at estimating time without clocks. The position of familiar stars, the height of the moon, the cooling temperature, the behavior of birds, the fading or strengthening of particular constellations. These observations rarely produced precise hours in the modern sense. They produced something more useful for everyday life. They answered practical questions. How much darkness remained? Should the group continue or stop? Would dawn arrive before reaching the next village? Was there enough time to cross the forest safely? Such estimates emerged from repeated experience rather than mathematical calculation. People who spent years outdoors developed astonishing confidence in reading the night sky. Cloud cover, however, removed this familiar guide almost instantly. A heavily overcast sky represented more than inconvenience. It erased one of the traveler's oldest companions. Without stars or moon, orientation became noticeably more difficult, particularly across open country where roads divided repeatedly. The importance of local guides becomes much easier to understand in this context. A guide did not merely know directions. He recognized landscapes under changing conditions. He remembered which stream produced louder sounds after heavy rain, which hillside remained visible longest during twilight, which crossroads contained weathered markers almost impossible for strangers to notice. Knowledge of place extended beyond geography into lived familiarity. Such expertise commanded genuine respect. Another overlooked reality of nighttime travel involved fatigue. Modern travelers frequently underestimate the physical effort required simply to remain alert in darkness. The eyes strain continuously. The mind evaluates uncertain shapes. Balance becomes more demanding. Progress slows. Even without obvious danger, nighttime movement consumes attention. After many hours, judgment begins to suffer. Medieval people understood this through experience rather than scientific studies. An exhausted traveler made poorer decisions. He missed landmarks. He stumbled more frequently. He became less aware of surrounding sounds. The sensible choice often involved stopping earlier than pride preferred. This practical wisdom appears repeatedly in medieval advice literature. Patience generally outweighed haste. A delayed arrival was preferable to an unnecessary accident. Yet necessity occasionally overruled caution. Medical emergencies, political crises, military campaigns, family tragedies, religious obligations. These circumstances sometimes forced people onto roads they would otherwise have avoided after dark. Their stories remind us that medieval knights were not chosen equally. Some journeys were voluntary, others were unavoidable. Imagine a father hurrying to fetch a physician from the nearest town. Imagine a priest summoned to hear the confession of a dying parishioner. Imagine a messenger carrying news of invasion. Imagine relatives traveling toward a household after hearing that illness had spread. Each traveler entered the same darkness for entirely different reasons. The emotional experience changed accordingly. Hope, urgency, grief, determination, fear, and duty all moved along the same roads. This emotional diversity is one reason medieval knights resist simple description. They were frightening for some, routine for others, sacred for many, profitable for merchants, necessary for workers, lonely for travelers, comforting for monks, demanding for watchmen. No single experience defined the medieval knight. Instead, darkness revealed whatever responsibilities each individual already carried. Perhaps this is the deepest irony of all. The night itself changed relatively little from person to person. The same stars crossed the sky, the same moon illuminated fields, the same wind moved through forests. What differed was the burden each traveler brought into that darkness. A merchant calculated profits and losses. A pilgrim measured spiritual progress. A soldier watched for enemies. A shepherd counted sheep. A mother listened for the breathing of her child. Darkness became a mirror reflecting different human concerns. And nowhere was that reflection more vivid than at the roadside inns where these different lives briefly converged. For when travelers from every corner of medieval society gathered beneath a single roof after sunset, the strange atmosphere of the medieval night acquired yet another layer, one shaped not by solitude, but by the uneasy intimacy of sharing darkness with complete strangers. For when travelers from every corner of medieval society gathered beneath a single roof after sunset, the strange atmosphere of the medieval night acquired yet another layer, one shaped not by solitude, but by the uneasy intimacy of sharing darkness with complete strangers. The medieval inn occupied a curious place in society. It was neither entirely private nor fully public. It belonged somewhere between the safety of home and the uncertainty of the open road. A traveler crossing its threshold left one set of risks behind but immediately entered another. The dangers were usually smaller than those found on an isolated road at midnight, yet they did not disappear altogether. They merely changed their form. The first impression was often one of warmth. After hours spent outdoors, particularly during autumn or winter, even a modest fire seemed generous. Smoke drifted upward through an imperfect chimney. Candles cast trembling circles of light across rough wooden tables. The smell of stew, fresh bread, damp wool, wet leather, horses, and with smoke mixed into an aroma that modern visitors might find surprisingly complex. The warmth, however, belonged to everyone. Unlike the private sitting rooms that many people enjoy today, the common room of a medieval inn gathered strangers into the same limited space. Merchants sat beside pilgrims. Local craftsmen might share a bench with traveling clerics. A messenger carrying official correspondence could eat only a few feet away from wandering musicians or laborers seeking seasonal work. For several hours, social boundaries softened without entirely disappearing. Conversation emerged naturally because information itself possessed value. Someone arriving from another town brought news, harvests, road conditions, political rumors, prices at distant markets, the health of a local lord, reports of disease, the opening or closing of important bridges. Every traveler carried knowledge unavailable to everyone else. This explains why inns often became informal centers of communication. Long before printed newspapers connected distant communities, ordinary conversations performed much the same function. A merchant who spent several weeks on the road frequently knew more about recent events than people who had remained in one village throughout the same period. Information traveled at the speed of human movement. Night gave that information time to circulate. Many historians understandably focus on medieval letters, royal decrees, and official records. Yet countless decisions throughout Europe rested upon something much simpler. Someone had heard something from another traveler over supper. Of course, not every story proved reliable. Rumors flourished on medieval roads just as they do across modern social media. A military victory became larger with each retelling. A disease outbreak spread farther in conversation than it had in reality. Bandits appeared more numerous after frightened travelers exchanged accounts. The remarkable thing is not that misinformation existed. It is that experienced listeners learned to evaluate it. Who told the story? Had they seen events personally? Did another traveler confirm the account? Did local circumstances make the report plausible? People developed surprisingly sophisticated habits of judging credibility long before professional journalism existed. This careful weighing of testimony reminds us again that medieval society cannot fairly be described as simply gullible. People questioned, compared, remembered, doubted. They simply worked with different sources of information. While conversation occupied the common room, another world existed only a few steps away. The stable. To many travelers, the horse represented their greatest financial investment. A merchant might carry valuable cloth, but without a healthy horse, neither merchant nor merchandise reached the next town efficiently. Consequently, arriving at an inn rarely ended one's responsibilities. Animals required attention before their owners rested. Harnesses came off. Hooves were inspected. Water was provided. Feed distributed. Any sign of injury demanded immediate concern. An experienced traveler often worried about his horse before worrying about himself. This practical priority reveals how closely human mobility depended upon animal health. Modern transport separates passengers from machinery. Medieval travel required constant partnership between people and living creatures. The stable itself remained active long after darkness settled. Stable boys moved quietly among stalls. Horses stamped their feet. Leather creaked. Buckets scraped against stone floors. Lantern light reflected softly from harness buckles. Even here, nighttime possessed its own rhythm distinct from daylight. Inside the inn, another practical matter gradually emerged. Sleeping arrangements. Modern hotels promise privacy. The medieval inn often promised shelter. Those were not always the same thing. Private rooms certainly existed in wealthier establishments or for distinguished guests, but many ordinary travelers expected to share sleeping space with people they had met only hours earlier. Large communal chambers were common. Several beds might occupy one room. Individual beds frequently held more than one sleeper. Space represented both expense and scarcity. Privacy remained a luxury rather than an assumption. To modern listeners, this arrangement may sound deeply uncomfortable. In truth, many medieval people already possessed extensive experience sharing sleeping spaces. Family members slept together. Servants shared quarters. Apprentices slept near workshops. Monastic dormitories accommodated entire religious communities. Communal sleeping, therefore, felt more familiar than it does today. Yet familiarity did not eliminate caution. A traveler still guarded personal belongings carefully. Money pouches stayed close. Documents remained protected. Weapons, where legally permitted and socially appropriate, were kept nearby. Trust existed alongside prudence. One did not necessarily expect one's companions to be dishonest. Neither did one tempt unnecessary opportunity. The famous expression, "sleep with one eye open," captures something of this atmosphere. although medieval people would not have phrased it quite that way. Rest came, but often lightly, an unfamiliar cough across the room, someone rising quietly before dawn, a horse becoming restless outside, the opening of a door. Each sound briefly interrupted sleep until its meaning became clear. Interestingly, this constant awareness probably reflected normal human behavior rather than exceptional anxiety. Anthropologists studying societies with communal sleeping arrangements frequently observe that individuals remain surprisingly sensitive to unfamiliar disturbances while continuing to rest effectively. The medieval inn illustrates this balance well. Travelers adapted. Complete silence was neither expected nor required. Instead, the mind learned to classify sounds quickly. That movement belonged to someone turning over in bed. Those footsteps came from the innkeeper beginning morning preparations. The horse outside merely shifted its weight. Nothing demanded immediate concern. Sleep resumed. Not every inn deserved equal confidence. Their quality varied enormously. Some earned excellent reputations over generations. Others became notorious for poor food, uncomfortable bedding, dishonest accounting, or careless management. Travelers remembered these differences. Recommendations spread naturally along commercial routes. Stay at the inn by the stone bridge. Avoid the one near the marsh. Such advice carried genuine value. Hospitality itself held significant moral importance throughout medieval Christian Europe. Innkeepers occupied an interesting social position because their livelihood depended upon welcoming strangers while also maintaining order. The best establishments balanced generosity with discipline. Food needed preparing. Rooms allocated fairly. Arguments settled before becoming dangerous. Animals cared for. Payments recorded. Supplies managed. Fire monitored continuously. An inn represented a surprisingly complicated business. Its success relied less upon luxury than reliability. Travelers returned where they expected honest treatment. Another subtle feature of inns deserves attention. They compressed geographical distance. Within a single evening, someone from the coast might meet someone from distant inland farming country. Regional accents mixed. Different customs appeared. Clothing styles varied. News from several counties might circulate beneath one roof. For people who spent most of their lives close to home, such encounters quietly expanded understanding of the wider world. Night encouraged this exchange because daylight demanded movement. During the day, travelers continued their separate journeys. After sunset, they paused together. This pause also produced moments of storytelling. Human beings naturally tell stories after work ends and before sleep begins. Medieval travelers were no exception. Some accounts entertained, others instructed. Experienced merchants described difficult roads. Pilgrims recounted remarkable churches. Soldiers remembered campaigns. Sailors described unfamiliar ports. Hunters spoke of unusual animals. Children today often imagine medieval evenings filled entirely with frightening ghost stories. Certainly tales of spirits, miracles, saints, mysterious encounters, and unexplained events circulated widely. But so did practical stories. Stories about weather, about foolish decisions, about successful bargains, about remarkable craftsmanship, about clever escapes from ordinary accidents. Narrative itself became a way of preserving useful experience. Someone listening carefully might avoid repeating another person's mistake. Not every lesson required a written book. The presence of strangers also sharpened awareness of identity. Questions naturally arose. Where have you come from? Where are you going? How far have you traveled? What trade do you practice? These questions sound ordinary. In the medieval world, they helped establish trust. People situated one another socially through conversation. Occupation, destination, place of origin, and mutual acquaintances all reduced uncertainty. A stranger became less mysterious once his story acquired recognizable details. Modern identification documents perform some of this work today. Medieval society relied much more heavily upon reputation and spoken explanation. Nighttime conversations therefore carried practical importance. By morning, yesterday's stranger might already possess a provisional place within the temporary community created by the inn. Food itself reflected the realities of travel. Most meals emphasized practicality rather than extravagance. Bread remained central. Pottage, a thick stew made from grains, vegetables, and whatever meat happened to be available, appeared frequently. Cheese traveled well. Ale often proved safer than uncertain water supplies because the brewing process reduced many harmful organisms, although medieval people understood this through experience rather than microbiology. Regional specialties varied considerably. A coastal inn offered different fare from one deep inland. Season shaped menus just as strongly as geography. Travelers rarely expected luxury. They expected enough nourishment to continue tomorrow's journey. One quiet irony emerges here. The medieval night often appears frightening in modern imagination because we focus upon extraordinary dangers. Yet much of the actual experience consisted of remarkably ordinary concerns. Would the horse recover from slight lameness? Would tomorrow's weather permit travel? Was the bread fresh? Would another blanket be available because temperatures had fallen unexpectedly? Could boots dry sufficiently beside the hearth before morning? Daily life retained its ordinary character even beneath unfamiliar roofs. Perhaps that ordinariness explains why medieval people proved more resilient than we sometimes imagine. Darkness did not overwhelm them every evening. It demanded adaptation. They responded through routines developed across generations. Still, certain nights resisted routine. Storms could force unexpected delays lasting several days. Flooded rivers trapped travelers together longer than planned. Political unrest occasionally closed roads entirely. Illness spread through crowded lodgings with uncomfortable speed. Winter snow sometimes isolated inns from neighboring settlements. During such periods, temporary communities became unexpectedly permanent. Strangers learned far more about one another than anyone had anticipated when they first entered seeking only supper and sleep. The inn therefore served another unexpected function. It became a place where patience itself was practiced. Travelers accustomed to controlling their own pace occasionally discovered that weather, illness, or simple circumstance had taken that control away. They waited, repaired equipment, listened to news, observed unfamiliar customs, shared stories, watched snow accumulate outside or rain continue without interruption. Time itself seemed to slow. Such enforced pauses reveal something essential about medieval travel. Journeys unfolded according to negotiation rather than command. Nature retained considerable authority. Human plans remained flexible because they had to be. This flexibility extended into attitudes toward arrival itself. Reaching a destination one day later than expected often mattered less than arriving safely. The road rewarded endurance more consistently than haste. As the evening in the inn gradually drew toward silence, candles shortened, conversations faded into murmurs, and one traveler after another settled beneath wool blankets. The building itself seemed to breathe more slowly. Outside, horses shifted quietly in their stalls. Rain, if it came, tapped softly against the roof. Wind found familiar gaps beneath doors and around shutters. Somewhere, the innkeeper checked the hearth one final time before retiring. For a few brief hours, people from entirely different worlds slept beneath the same roof, suspended between the places they had left behind and the destinations still waiting beyond tomorrow's horizon. And when the first traveler quietly rose in the darkness long before sunrise, careful not to wake the others, reaching for boots still damp from yesterday's road. The medieval night had not quite released its hold, for another day's journey was already beginning before the old one had fully disappeared. The first traveler to rise rarely did so with haste. In the uncertain light before dawn, every movement was measured. Boots that had spent the night drying near the hearth were checked carefully, not simply pulled on. Leather stiffened by yesterday's rain might rub painfully after several miles. A broken lace, insignificant inside a warm room, could become a serious inconvenience halfway across open country. Travel rewarded preparation in remarkably ordinary ways. A buckle tightened properly before departure might prevent an accident hours later. A waterskin filled before leaving the inn might spare an unnecessary delay. A horse examined carefully in the stable might reveal a loose shoe before it became a dangerous problem on rough ground. The medieval traveler learned to think several hours ahead because immediate solutions were not always available. This habit of quiet foresight shaped much more than travel. It reflected an entire way of living within material limits. Modern convenience often allows us to postpone small decisions until they become necessary. The medieval world offered fewer such opportunities. Preparation frequently proved easier than correction. As the first guests stirred, the inn itself slowly awakened in stages. Someone added fresh wood to the fire. Ashes from the previous evening were pushed aside to reveal glowing embers still alive beneath their gray covering. Medieval hearths were rarely extinguished completely if fuel could be spared. Preserving a fire overnight demanded far less effort than creating a new one from cold flint and tinder every morning. That quiet bed of surviving embers carried symbolic significance as well. Just as daylight emerged gradually from darkness, the household fire often returned from apparent sleep without ever truly having died. Many ordinary routines followed this same pattern. Continuation rather than sudden beginning. The innkeeper's household had usually been awake for some time before the first traveler entered the common room. Bread might already be warming, ill-drawn. Porridge stirred steadily above the rekindled fire. Servants moved quietly through familiar tasks performed hundreds, perhaps thousands of times before. There is something deeply revealing about this unseen labor. The comfort enjoyed by travelers rested upon work completed while most of them remained asleep. That I end this respect. Medieval inns resembled almost every other institution. Visible activity depended upon invisible preparation. Monasteries required lay workers. Castles required servants. Markets required bakers who began work before dawn. Even villages relied upon people whose daily schedules rarely matched those of their neighbors. Night and early morning quietly redistributed labor across society. One traveler departed while another still dreamed. One household prepared breakfast while another had not yet stirred. Time overlapped rather than dividing neatly into separate compartments. Outside, the stable possessed its own morning rhythm. Horses often sensed approaching departure before their owners announced it. The familiar sounds of harness being lifted, leather straps adjusted, and grain buckets moved about the stable carried meaning for experienced animals. Many horses traveled the same roads repeatedly. Routine became familiar to them as well. This reminds us that medieval transportation relied upon intelligent creatures capable of memory, temperament, fatigue, and preference. Some horses remained calm beneath almost every circumstance. Others startled easily. Some worked steadily over long distances. Others possessed greater speed but required more careful handling. Travelers knew these differences intimately because their own safety often depended upon them. Before leaving, experienced riders frequently examined not only the horse but the equipment itself. Leather shrank when dried too quickly beside a hot fire. Metal buckles loosened. Straps stretched after rain. Small defects invisible yesterday became obvious in better morning light. Again, we encounter the practical advantage of dawn. The return of visibility allowed careful inspection. Problems hidden overnight became manageable before they became dangerous. The road itself also looked different in early morning. Mist often lay low across meadows while higher ground remained clear. Spider webs stretched between grasses, suddenly visible because tiny drops of dew caught the first light. Fresh wool tracks crossed damp earth. Animal prints appeared sharply defined in soft mud. The landscape displayed evidence gathered during the unseen hours. To someone attentive, morning resembled reading a document written by the night. A fox had crossed here. Several sheep had wandered near this hedge. Someone on horseback passed before sunrise. Rain began briefly and then stopped. The signs remained visible for only a few hours before daily activity erased them. Medieval people, particularly those accustomed to outdoor work, became remarkably skilled at reading these temporary records. Hunters naturally developed this ability to an exceptional degree. Tracking required patience rather than speed. A bent blade of grass, a freshly disturbed patch of leaves, broken twigs, faint impressions left by hooves. None of these details mattered alone. Together they formed a coherent narrative. Contrary to popular imagination, such skills were not magical. They reflected close observation practiced over many years. The same patient attention benefited shepherds searching for missing animals, foresters monitoring woodland paths, and even villagers curious about unusual visitors who had passed during the night. Morning therefore encouraged investigation. The road preserved stories briefly before the day's traffic erased them. This close relationship between people and landscape shaped medieval attitudes toward distance itself. Today we often measure journeys numerically. 10 miles, 50 kilometers, 2 hours by car. Medieval travelers thought differently. Distance depended upon conditions. The same road changed character with weather, season, and available daylight. A route considered manageable in June might become exhausting in November. Spring rains transformed firm tracks into deep mud. Winter frost sometimes hardened roads enough to improve travel, only for midday thaw to undo that advantage. Distance therefore possessed texture rather than simply length. Night intensified these variations because darkness amplified every difficulty. One muddy crossing delayed the entire day's progress. One damaged bridge forced a lengthy detour. One swollen stream required waiting until water levels fell. This uncertainty explains why medieval itineraries often appear flexible to modern historians. Arrival dates shifted naturally. Expectation accommodated reality. The road dictated its own pace. Weather retained the final authority. The influence of weather extended beyond physical movement. It affected emotion. A clear morning following a difficult night could transform morale almost immediately. Sunlight drying soaked clothing. Mist lifting from valleys. The reassuring appearance of distant church towers. Even after exhausting travel, these ordinary sights encouraged renewed confidence. Conversely, waking to relentless rain created immediate discouragement, not because medieval people lacked resilience, but because they understood exactly what such weather implied. Slower roads, colder clothing, reduced visibility, harder river crossings, greater strain upon horses. Practical concerns shaped emotional responses. Another subtle feature of medieval mornings involved smell. The scents that emerged after sunrise differed noticeably from those of the previous evening. Smoke from breakfast fires drifted through villages. Fresh bread replaced last night's cooking. Damp earth released richer aromas as temperatures slowly rose. Livestock emerged from shelters. Fresh-cut wood, newly opened stables, brewing ale, wet hay, and tilled soil all announced the beginning of another working day. These changing smells carried information. A traveler approaching a settlement often recognized its presence before seeing it. Would smoke rising on still morning air suggested occupied homes nearby. The unmistakable scent of tanneries announced certain towns long before their walls appeared. Fishing ports possessed entirely different odors from inland market villages. Smell quietly assisted navigation. We tend to overlook this because modern environments often suppress natural variation through industrial materials and enclosed spaces. The medieval world smelled more distinctive from place to place. Morning also restored color. This simple transformation deserves more attention than it usually receives. Throughout the night, moonlight reduced much of the landscape to subtle variations of gray, black, and pale silver. At sunrise, color returned gradually. Green fields emerged first, then reddish roof tiles, brown timber beams, blue garments, golden straw, whitewashed walls reflecting fresh light. The world became recognizable not merely because it grew brighter, but because it regained visual richness. Artists working in the Middle Ages understood this relationship instinctively. Illuminated manuscripts frequently employed gold leaf to suggest divine illumination rather than ordinary daylight, yet their treatment of dawn often reflected the quiet transition from darkness toward recognizable color. The experience itself remained familiar to anyone who regularly rose before sunrise. Perhaps because these changes occurred daily, medieval writers rarely described them in elaborate language. The ordinary becomes nearly invisible to those who experience it constantly. We encounter this challenge repeatedly as historians. Much of medieval life went unrecorded precisely because it seemed too obvious to mention. No one needed to explain that roads looked different after rain. Everyone already knew. No one carefully documented the smell of damp wool drying beside a fire. No explanation seemed necessary. Recovering these ordinary experiences requires reading surviving evidence with unusual patience. Household accounts, travel narratives, monastic rules, legal disputes, medical texts, personal letters. Each preserves small fragments. Only together do they reveal the texture of daily life. One particularly revealing source comes from medieval regulations governing markets and town gates. Many towns established clear opening and closing routines tied directly to daylight. Merchants arriving before the gates opened simply waited. Livestock gathered outside walls. Carts lined up along approaching roads. The town itself seemed asleep until official routines resumed. This reminds us that medieval mornings unfolded collectively. Communities woke together. Church bells announced more than prayer. They synchronized activity, the opening of gates, the beginning of trade, the resumption of ordinary civic life. Night had temporarily suspended certain aspects of society. Morning restored them. Not every settlement followed identical customs, of course. Europe contained remarkable diversity throughout the Middle Ages. Practices differed between kingdoms, climates, languages, and legal traditions. Yet beneath these variations lay a remarkably consistent reality. Human activity still revolved around natural light. That shared dependence linked communities separated by hundreds of miles. A farmer in England, a merchant in northern France, a monk in Germany, and a shepherd in northern Italy all recognized the practical meaning of dawn despite speaking different languages and living under different rulers. The sun imposed a rhythm more universal than politics. Yet, as dependable as dawn appeared, medieval people also understood that not every traveler greeted it with equal relief. Some reached morning safely after anxious nights on unfamiliar roads. Others discovered that daylight merely revealed new difficulties. A washed-out bridge, an injured horse, a missing companion, a cart axle cracked during yesterday's journey. a swollen river impossible to cross. Morning answered some questions only by presenting new ones. Life seldom paused long enough to provide complete certainty. In many respects, this continual exchange between reassurance and uncertainty defined the medieval experience of travel. Each sunrise restored visibility. It did not eliminate risk. The road remained unpredictable. The weather remained independent. Human plans remained provisional. Perhaps that is why medieval travelers developed such respect for patience. Progress measured only in miles would have seemed incomplete. A successful journey also required judgment, endurance, adaptability, and the willingness to accept circumstances beyond one's control. And nowhere would those qualities be tested more thoroughly than on the long stretches of road where settlements grew farther apart. Forests deepened, rivers widened, and the reassuring signs of nearby human habitation gradually disappeared, leaving travelers to depend increasingly upon their own experience, their companions, and the changing face of the medieval landscape itself. I hope, by now, medieval night feels a little different than it did when we first began this journey. At the beginning, it may have seemed tempting to think of darkness simply as an absence of light, a daily inconvenience made far worse by primitive technology. But the deeper we have traveled, the more we have discovered that the medieval night was an entire world with its own rhythms, expectations, and unwritten rules. It shaped the way people built their homes, planned their journeys, organized their labor, raised their children, guarded their communities, and understood both the natural and spiritual worlds around them. A single candle was never just a candle. It represented precious resources, careful planning, and a fragile boundary between familiarity and uncertainty. A church bell ringing through the darkness was never simply a clock. It reminded entire communities that order still existed beyond what their eyes could see. A road after sunset was never merely empty. It carried merchants hoping to reach tomorrow's market, pilgrims searching for sacred places, watchmen protecting sleeping towns, messengers carrying urgent news, anxious families seeking help, and countless ordinary people making careful decisions with far less certainty than most of us experience today. Perhaps the greatest surprise is that medieval nights were not defined primarily by fear. They were defined by adaptation. People learned to live within limits rather than trying to erase them. They accepted that darkness would always return. Instead of attempting to conquer the night completely, they organized their lives around its arrival. They developed routines, shared knowledge, community watchfulness, hospitality, prayer, practical wisdom handed quietly from one generation to the next. What can sometimes appear to us as superstition often rested upon generations of careful observation mixed with the beliefs of the age. What appears uncomfortable was frequently ordinary. What seems mysterious today often made perfect practical sense to those living through it. That is one of history's most valuable lessons. The past rarely becomes understandable by asking whether people were right or wrong according to modern standards. It becomes understandable when we ask what the world looked like from where they stood. Imagine, for just a moment, stepping outside a modest timber house sometime in the 14th century. There are no distant streetlights softening the horizon, no glow from passing cars, no electric hum filling the air. Above you stretches a sky crowded with stars, brighter than many modern people have ever seen. Around you lie fields that disappear into shadow. A dog barks somewhere beyond the village. Smoke from dying hearth fires drifts quietly through the cool air. Far away, perhaps almost beyond hearing, a monastery bell marks another passing hour. Tomorrow's work is waiting. The weather is uncertain. The harvest may succeed or fail. Your neighbors sleep behind wooden doors not very different from your own. For a few hours, the world belongs to darkness. Not because humanity has disappeared, but because humanity has learned, with remarkable patience, to to coexist with something it cannot control. And when dawn finally arrives, bringing back color, certainty, and familiar faces, it feels less like the beginning of a new day than the successful completion of another night. Perhaps that is the quiet truth hidden beneath all the strange stories surrounding medieval darkness. The unsettling part was never simply the absence of light. It was the constant reminder that the world remained larger than human certainty. And yet, despite that uncertainty, or perhaps because of it, millions of ordinary people built families, communities, friendships, faith, and entire civilizations beneath those same dark skies. The medieval night was not merely endured, it was lived. If one detail from tonight's journey surprised you the most, I genuinely enjoy hearing which part changed the way you imagine medieval life. Sometimes the smallest everyday realities reveal far more about the past than the grandest battles or the most famous kings. And if you've enjoyed spending this quiet evening exploring history together, I hope you'll join me again for another calm journey into the forgotten corners of the past. Until next time, thank you for listening, and sleep well.